You were never supposed to hear this. Not in full, not like this. The records are buried in yellowing pages, sealed inside county archives where dust and silence keep their secrets. But secrets rot, and when they rot, they seep. And the story that seeped out of the Missouri Ozarks in 1834 is one of the most disturbing fragments of American history. An infection that spread through a forgotten hollow, where faith, law, and blood all collided in ways that still whisper across the generations. They called it the case of Prudence Hoffman. To her neighbors, she was just another widow fighting to keep her children alive against the hunger of the wilderness. But behind her quiet eyes, a storm was building, one that would leave graves scattered across Cedar Hollow and suspicions that stretched all the way into the shadows of government halls in St. Louis. This is not the polished history they teach in classrooms. This is the kind of history that hides beneath polite records. The history of whispers exchanged at funerals, of children warned not to wander too far at dusk, of women clutching their sons tighter because something unspoken prowled in the dark. The official story says her children died in accidents. 3 boys, taken one by one, as though cursed. But curses don't leave footprints in the mud. They don't ask questions about where a boy walks at dawn or what trail he takes up a ridge. Human hands do that, and it was those hands that Prudence believed had stolen her sons. What follows is not just the story of a mother breaking under grief. It is a chronicle of how communities wear masks, how leaders smile while concealing rot, and how a single woman, stripped of everything, can become a weapon forged in grief and fire. You are about to walk into Cedar Hollow, a place where the wilderness wasn't the most dangerous thing lurking in the trees. And as you listen, know this: some knowledge cannot be unlearned. Once you enter, you are changed. Because this story is not about the past, it is about power, about the lengths to which men will go to protect it, and about how sometimes madness and justice wear the same face. Cedar Hollow. Even the name sounds harmless, doesn't it? A little frontier outpost carved into the Missouri Ozarks, no more than 40 families surviving at the mercy of the wilderness. From a distance, it looked like an ordinary settlement. Log cabins clustered around a meeting house, smoke curling from chimneys, the faint echo of an iron bell drifting across the hills. But if you stood long enough at the edge of those woods, you would feel it. The weight, the quiet that wasn't really quiet at all, but charged like the silence before a storm breaks. The Ozarks of the 1830s were not gentle. Towering oak forests shut out the sky, limestone bluffs cut the land into jagged wounds, and winters bit into bone like wolves that never tired of hunting. Life here demanded trust. Neighbors tilled fields together, shared tools, helped bury each other's dead. That's what survival required. But trust is the easiest mask to wear. Behind the handshakes and borrowed sugar lived old grudges, debts that could not be paid, whispered rumors of bloodlines and inheritance, and bargains struck in the dark. Prudence Hoffman entered this fragile community as a young wife and mother, carrying a kind of dignity that unsettled some and inspired envy in others. Her husband Samuel died of lung fever before his sons were grown, leaving her to fight through winters with 3 boys clinging to her strength. On the surface, she became the model frontier widow, hardworking, pious, endlessly devoted. Her cabin was immaculate, her garden thrived where others failed, and her boys were so well-mannered they drew praise even from the harshest tongues. But Cedar Hollow was not what it pretended to be. Its leaders, the landowners, the matrons, the reverend who spoke with thunder in his voice, all had their own secrets. And slowly, imperceptibly, Prudence and her boys were drawn into those hidden currents. A favor here, a debt there, questions too pointed to be casual. Josiah Grimby, the richest farmer, sent his sons to help at her cabin, but always expected repayment measured not in coin but obedience. Meritable Stokes, the matron, gave food and medicine, but her generosity was laced with ownership. And Reverend Corwin, he asked questions meant for confession, but too often about land, loyalty, and bloodlines. To live in Cedar Hollow was to live in a web, every thread sticky with obligation and control, and Prudence's family, isolated, vulnerable, bound by her widowhood, was caught at the center. What no one expected was that the quiet widow they thought they owned would one day pull the web down around them. The first death came with the thaw of spring, March of 1834. The earth was still brittle with frost, the air sharp with the last bite of winter. Prudence's eldest, Thomas, had risen before dawn, just as he always did, to check the rabbit snares on the ridge above Cedar Hollow. 12 years old, steady, dependable, already shouldering the weight of a man's responsibilities. His father's knife at his side, his boots crunching against the frozen ground, he moved with the confidence of someone who knew those trails better than most grown men. But confidence does not stop gravity. It does not stop betrayal. By mid-morning, the bell in the meeting house was clanging, a sound every settler knew meant fire, raid, or death. The men of the hollow sprinted toward Miller's Bluff, a limestone ledge that overlooked the valley. What they found at the base of that cliff would haunt them for years. Thomas Hoffman lay broken across the rocks, his body twisted, his skull crushed, blood already congealing in the cold. His eyes were open, frozen wide at the pale Missouri sky, as though he'd seen something no child should ever see in his last breath. The official word spread quickly: a tragic fall. The rocks were slick with frost, the path narrow, the dawn too dim. Accidents happen. That was the story Reverend Corwin repeated at the funeral, his voice carrying over the graves like a balm meant to soothe the hollow's unease. But not every detail fit. Some men noticed the tracks in the mud. Hobnailed boots, heavy, deliberate. Not Thomas's small prints. They stopped just short of the cliff's edge, as though someone had followed him, cornered him, driven him forward. His hands were bruised, knuckles torn, forearms scored with defensive cuts. He hadn't just fallen, he had fought. Neighbors whispered, but never loudly. Cedar Hollow depended on unity, and unity meant silence. But Prudence saw what others denied. She stood at the grave with her younger sons pressed against her sides, her black dress whipping in the wind. She did not weep. She watched. Her eyes scanned the faces of the mourners like a hunter searching for movement in the brush. And when she finally spoke, her words were barely louder than the wind. "They killed my boy." The community called it grief, but Prudence knew better. And in that moment, the widow who once depended on Cedar Hollow began to see the truth: the hollow itself was devouring her family. After Thomas was lowered into the earth, Cedar Hollow tried to resume its rhythm. Men plowed their fields, women churned butter and traded jars of preserves, children ran barefoot through the same dusty paths, as though death had not passed among them. But for Prudence Hoffman, nothing looked the same. Grief had a way of stripping away illusions, and what she began to see was not the hollow she had known, but the hollow as it truly was. Every face at the funeral replayed itself in her memory. The way Josiah Grimby had stared too long at the coffin, lips pressed thin as though swallowing words he dared not speak. The way Meritable Stokes whispered fiercely to a neighbor, only to fall silent when Prudence's gaze swept across her. Even Reverend Corwin, whose voice had shaken the trees with righteous sorrow, had avoided meeting her eyes as the final clods of dirt fell onto the child's grave. In the weeks that followed, Prudence began to notice other things, small things, but sharper now, like splinters working their way to the surface. Questions that once seemed harmless now rang with menace. Grimby had asked how often Thomas checked the snares, which path he preferred, whether he went before dawn or after. At the time, she'd thought it neighborly interest. Now, it sounded like preparation. And Meritable, her constant visits, her gifts of preserves and medicines, her endless questions about the boys' routines. What chores did they do? Which fields did they cross to fetch water? Who came to the cabin when Prudence was away? All those details, gathered under the guise of charity, now felt like threads being pulled into some hidden pattern. Prudence's mind sharpened under the weight of loss. She recalled conversations she had half forgotten, glances exchanged at community meetings, arguments about land boundaries settled too quickly, too quietly, threads connected where before there had only been fragments. And through it all, she began to feel the shape of something larger, something older than Thomas's fall. The hollow's unity was a lie. Its leaders had always kept the weaker families bound by debts of gratitude, by obligations no one dared question. Survival was the mask. Control was the face behind it. And now, with her eldest son gone, Prudence began to understand the cost of being a widow on the margins of a community that fed on its own. Beneath her grief, another force stirred. Not despair, not helplessness, but something colder, sharper, the birth of suspicion, the seed of vengeance. It was late May when Cedar Hollow was struck again. The valley had ripened into green, fields heavy with the promise of summer, children running barefoot in the warm dust. Life had returned to its rhythm. But Prudence lived each day like a woman standing on the edge of a precipice, her remaining boys her only tether to sanity. Benjamin was 9, quieter than Thomas, with an intelligence that drew whispers of admiration even from the stern schoolmaster. He was the boy who lingered over books when others scrambled to play, who asked questions about the stars, the soil, the hidden workings of the world. If Thomas had carried his father's steadiness, Benjamin carried something rarer: vision. Prudence often said he was the one who might escape Cedar Hollow, the one who might one day reach beyond the Ozarks. But the Hollow had other plans. On an afternoon thick with summer heat, Benjamin went to fetch water from the well near the meeting house. It was a simple task, one he had done countless times before. The bucket was found first, floating on its side in the water, rope trailing as if abandoned mid-task. The boy's body was discovered not long after, pulled lifeless from the well by men whose faces blanched at what they saw. The story told itself before the facts could form. He slipped. The rope snapped. He leaned too far. Another accident. 2 sons gone in 3 months, and both explained away with the same hollow reasoning Cedar Hollow clung to like scripture. But accidents do not leave bruises around the wrists, as though someone had gripped too hard. They do not leave scratches on the stone rim of a well, desperate claw marks where small hands had fought to hold on. And they do not silence a boy known for caution, for calculation, for his ability to avoid mistakes others made. The whispers grew louder this time. Neighbors spoke in kitchens and barns, not in the open, but the words still traveled. Some said Prudence was cursed, others that she was careless, perhaps unfit. A few lowered their voices even further, hinting at something darker, that the widow herself had brought misfortune upon her house. At the funeral, Prudence did not weep. She stood rigid, Isaac clinging to her skirts, her eyes searching the faces around her. Each glance was a question unspoken: who watched him, who followed, who pushed. The hollow shifted uneasily under her gaze, but no one spoke the truth. 2 sons gone, 1 left, and the widow of Cedar Hollow now understood with terrifying clarity. Someone was dismantling her life, piece by piece. By the time the second grave was dug in Cedar Hollow's cemetery, Prudence Hoffman was no longer a grieving widow. She had become something else, something the community did not yet recognize. Grief has stages, they say: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. But that is the language of the civilized world. Out in the Ozarks of 1834, there was only survival, and survival does not allow for stages. It creates mutations. It sharpens sorrow into a weapon. Prudence moved like a ghost through the routines of daily life, but her eyes were alive with calculation. Every visit from Meritable Stokes became an interrogation disguised as hospitality. Every offer of help from the Grimby boys became a ledger entry, a record of who came near her home and when. Even the Reverend's sermons were studied, not for their scripture, but for the words he chose to emphasize, the glances he exchanged with men in the pews. To the community, she still appeared dutiful, her cabin orderly, her garden thriving, her youngest son Isaac clinging to her skirts like a shadow. But those who looked closely sensed something beneath the surface. Her silence no longer read as sorrow. It carried the weight of suspicion, of watchfulness, of judgment. She began to walk the hollow differently. She lingered at the well, eyes tracing the stone rim where Benjamin's small fingers had left desperate scratches. She walked the ridge where Thomas had fallen, studying the earth where unfamiliar boot prints had been half erased by time. She asked questions that made neighbors uneasy, questions that forced them to repeat details they preferred to forget. And though no one ever answered directly, their hesitation spoke volumes. In the evenings, after Isaac was asleep, she sat by the fire with Samuel's old hunting knife in her lap. Her hands traced its worn handle, her reflection flickering in the blade. It was not madness that filled her then. It was clarity. She understood what no one else dared to admit: Cedar Hollow was not a community. It was a hierarchy, a system of debts and silence, and someone within that system had marked her family as expendable. If the Hollow thought she would crumble under the weight of loss, it miscalculated. The mask of the grieving widow was useful. It kept others at bay, shielded her suspicions. But inside, something older, harder was taking root. Prudence Hoffman was no longer waiting for protection. She was preparing for war. By late summer, the air in Cedar Hollow had grown heavy, thick with heat and silence. The crops leaned tall in the fields, cicadas droned endlessly in the trees, and beneath it all was a waiting stillness, like a collective breath held too long. 2 boys were already buried in the churchyard. Only Isaac remained. He was 6, small, tender, still clinging to his mother's skirts with the desperate devotion of a child too young to understand the full weight of loss. He slept in the loft above Prudence's bed, his soft breathing the only sound that reassured her in the darkest hours of night. She watched him constantly. Every chore, every errand, every step beyond the cabin was shadowed by her presence. She had already lost 2 sons. She would not, she swore, lose the last. But the Hollow watched too. Neighbors began to speak less openly when Prudence entered a room. Men looked away too quickly. Women's conversations shifted in unnatural silences. Isaac, innocent though he was, could feel the change. He told his mother one night that a man had followed him near the barn, heavy boots crunching behind him, though when he turned, no one was there. Another evening, Prudence found the latch on the chicken coop broken, the small tracks of Isaac's feet mixed with larger prints she did not recognize. She stared at those impressions in the dirt until her breath came ragged, because she knew them, the same hobnailed pattern she had seen near Thomas's broken body. The night before it happened, Prudence kept Isaac close by the hearth, whispering stories her grandmother had told her, stories of spirits that guarded children from the harm of men. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled as they smoothed his hair. Some part of her already knew what the dawn would bring. It came on a morning drenched in mist, when Isaac wandered only a few steps from the cabin to chase a stray hen. His laughter carried through the fog, and then it stopped. When Prudence ran to him, she found the boy's body at the edge of the woods, twisted among broken branches as though dropped from the air itself. His neck was snapped clean. His eyes were open, just like his brother's. 3 sons gone in 6 months, all called accidents. But no accident leaves the same shadow behind each death. No accident hunts a family like prey. Cedar Hollow had taken everything from Prudence Hoffman, and now the Hollow would learn what it meant to awaken the fury of a mother with nothing left to lose. After Isaac's burial, Cedar Hollow fell into an uneasy quiet. 3 funerals in 6 months had left the churchyard raw with fresh earth, the wooden markers still pale against the grass. People still plowed fields, still traded at the mill, still gathered on Sundays, but their eyes carried shadows that words could not name. The Hollow whispered of storms, curses, ill omens, anything but the truth. For Prudence there was no whispering left. She did not shed tears at the graveside. She did not kneel, did not pray. Instead she stood stiff and straight, her black dress like a blade among the bowed figures. When Reverend Corwin finished his sermon about God's mysterious will, Prudence raised her head and said, clear enough for the mourners to hear, God had nothing to do with this. The words cracked through the silence like a whip. No one answered. Some shifted uneasily, others crossed themselves. A few stared openly, daring her to say more. She did not. She didn't need to. In the weeks that followed, the hollowness of Cedar Hollow became harder to deny. Men began to lock their doors at night, a practice once unheard of in the valley. Women stopped letting children run freely along the paths. People who had once gathered in large, laughing circles at dusk now stayed in small, watchful clusters. The Hollow was unraveling, its unity collapsing beneath the weight of fear. Prudence fueled it without a word. Her silence became its own kind of sermon. She walked the paths with her head high, her gaze cutting through the fog of lies. She stood longer than necessary at the well, her hand grazing the stone rim where Benjamin had clawed for his life. She lingered near Miller's Bluff, eyes fixed on the rocks that had broken Thomas's body. She traced the woods where Isaac's small form had been left like refuse. She wanted them all to see her there, to feel the accusation burning in her presence. Some began to call her cursed. Others whispered witch. A few muttered murderess, as though it were she who had broken her sons. But those words came from fear, not conviction. For deep down, every man and woman in Cedar Hollow felt the same creeping truthy. Someone among them had done this, and the widow they had underestimated was no longer mourning. She was watching, waiting, and in her silence, the Hollow began to see itself reflected, ugly, guilty, afraid. By autumn, Cedar Hollow had turned inward on itself. Corn stalks browned in the fields, wood smoke curled over cabins, and the hills glowed red with dying leaves. But the beauty of the season only sharpened the unease. Every family carried suspicion now. Every neighbor eyed the other with the quiet dread of prey that suspects the predator walks among them. Prudence moved through this atmosphere like a blade through cloth. She no longer asked questions outright. Instead, she tested people. A comment dropped here, a half-truth offered there. She would mention seeing boot tracks near the ridge and watch which faces stiffened. She would let slip that Benjamin had confided fears to her, lies she invented on the spot, and then Mark, who grew pale. These were not accusations. They were probes, like tapping the boards of a rotting floor to find where the wood would give. And the wood was beginning to give. Josiah Grimby, once loud and jovial, now stammered when she approached, his hands fidgeting with his hat brim. Maritable Stokes, who had once crowded her cabin with gifts and advice, now avoided her altogether. Her visits abruptly ceased. Even Reverend Corwin faltered mid-sermon when Prudence's eyes fixed on him too long, his words tangling as though guilt choked the scripture from his throat. It wasn't proof, not yet, but it was movement, and movement meant the hollow was cracking. At night, Prudence sat by her hearth, Samuel's hunting knife gleaming in the firelight, her mind replaying the details. Tracks, glances, hesitations. She had nothing she could show, nothing that would stand in the daylight, but she no longer needed the hollow's justice. She wasn't seeking their agreement. She was seeking certainty for herself. And once certainty came, so would judgment. She began to lay small traps of her own. She left Isaac's wooden toy soldier at the edge of the woods, then returned the next day to find it moved deeper, as though someone had taken it and placed it back. She loosened the latch on her door one night and found it open at dawn, the faintest smell of pipe smoke lingering in the cabin. Someone was circling her still, even now when her sons were gone. Whoever they were, they hadn't finished with her, and that was their mistake, because Prudence Hoffman no longer feared Cedar Hollow. She had been stripped of everything, and a woman with nothing left was the most dangerous thing the hollow could have birthed. It started quietly. At the communal well, she lingered too long, her hands brushing the stone rim as she spoke of Benjamin's last moments. His nails were still there, she said evenly, her eyes locked on the faces around her. Scratches in the rock, as though he was pushed. She let the words hang, and though no one answered, she noticed who set down their buckets too quickly, who turned away with forced calm. On another day, she stood at Miller's Bluff, the place where Thomas had fallen, and spoke as if to herself, but loud enough for the hunters nearby to hear. Funny, she murmured. The boots that followed him weren't his size. Too large, too heavy. Again, silence. But silence was a language, and she was learning to read it fluently. By now, the hollow was fraying badly. Families whispered behind shuttered windows. Men carried muskets into the woods even for simple errands. The old neighborly trust had curdled into fear, and at the center of it all walked the widow, black-clad, unyielding, her presence like a plague no one could shake. Then came the night she stopped hinting and began accusing, without names but with fire. At the meeting house, as Reverend Corwin preached of trials sent by God, Prudence rose from her seat. Her voice was low, steady, but it cut through his sermon like thunder. 3 children, she said, 3 graves dug before their time, and still you call it chance. Still you call it God's will. But I tell you, these were no accidents. Someone among you has blood on their hands. Gasps rippled through the room. Some stared at her with pity, others with fear, a few with anger. But no one spoke to deny it. Not one soul said she was wrong. From that night forward, Cedar Hollow changed. Doors locked faster at dusk. Neighbors avoided her eyes. And yet, under their breath, the settlers began to murmur what had been unspeakable before, that maybe the widow was right. Maybe death had not come from chance or curse. Maybe it had come from within. Prudence Hoffman had torn the mask away. Now the hollow stood bare, exposed and trembling. By November, Cedar Hollow no longer felt like a settlement. It felt like a cage filled with animals snapping at one another through the bars. The widow's words had cracked something loose inside the community, and once suspicion escaped, it could not be caged again. The first signs came in whispers. Josiah Grimby stopped sharing his tobacco at the mill, muttering that men had been watching him with narrowed eyes. Maritable Stokes's visits to neighbors dwindled after someone remarked that she always seemed to know too much about their children. Reverend Corwin's sermons grew shrill, his voice breaking as he thundered warnings about gossip, slander, and the devil's work. Though the more he protested, the less convincing he sounded. Then came the open quarrels. At a barn raising, 2 men nearly came to blows over whether Grimby had been seen near Miller's Bluff on the morning Thomas died. In the meeting house, women hissed at one another over whether Meritable's herbs were healing tonics or poisons. And one night, a musket shot rang through the valley, fired into the darkness, at no one, but it left the hollow rattling with unease. Prudence watched all of it with cold clarity. She didn't need to raise her voice anymore. The hollow was unraveling without her hand. Every silence, every sideways glance, every clenched jaw spoke louder than accusations. The community that had buried her sons beneath the word accident was now choking on its own fear. Yet Prudence was not content to watch. She fed the fire carefully, a remark here, a story there. To one neighbor she whispered that she had seen muddy boots outside her cabin again, larger than Samuel's had ever been. To another, she mentioned hearing footsteps in the woods at night, too heavy for a woman, too deliberate for a deer. She never accused directly. She didn't have to. The hollow did the work for her. And beneath the chaos, she sharpened herself. At night, she practiced with Samuel's knife, the blade flashing in the hearthlight. She stacked her firewood high against the walls, not for warmth but as barricades. She counted every musket shot left in her chest, every powder horn filled, every knife hung to a whispering edge. The hollow thought it was watching her unravel. In truth, it was watching her transform. And as Cedar Hollow turned against itself, Prudence Hoffman was already preparing to turn against Cedar Hollow. It happened on a Sunday, the day the hollow was meant to feel safest, when the bell tower called families together for worship. The meeting house stood full, 40 souls pressed close, their faces lit by the pale glow of oil lamps. The Reverend's voice thundered through the rafters about unity, about forgiveness, about resisting the whispers of Satan. But his words landed hollow. People weren't listening to God anymore. They were listening to each other's breathing, the creak of boots, the scrape of chairs. Prudence sat in the back, her black dress absorbing the light like a shadow-given form. She didn't bow her head when others prayed. She didn't mouth the hymns. She only watched. Every twitch of Grimby's jaw, every tightening of Meritable's hands on her shawl. She was reading them like scripture written in flesh. The breaking point came sudden, like lightning splitting a tree. One of Grimby's farmhands, young and clumsy with fear, blurted that he'd seen his master near the Hoffman cabin late at night. The room turned. Grimby rose red-faced, roaring that the boy lied, that Prudence had poisoned his mind. But before he could finish, another voice called out. An older woman, trembling as she confessed, she had seen strange smoke rising from Meritable Stokes's chimney the very morning Benjamin died. The room exploded. Shouts clashed, fists slammed on pews, accusations poured like floodwater. For the first time, the respectable faces of Cedar Hollow showed their true shapes: hungry, suspicious, feral. A chair toppled, a hymn book flew, someone's musket clattered to the floor. Children began to cry. Through it all, Prudence did not move. Her silence was louder than the shouting, and people saw it. Some began to look at her as though she had conjured this madness, as though her grief had become witchcraft. Others saw her as the only honest one left, the widow who had told the truth from the start. Lines were being drawn in the sawdust on the meeting house floor, and there was no going back. When the bell finally rang, not for worship, but as alarm, neighbors stormed out into the night, scattering in factions. The hollow that had once survived by unity was now fractured into suspicion and fury. And Prudence, walking home through the dark with Isaac pressed against her side, felt the air shift. The time for mourning was finished. The time for retribution had begun. The first death came not by accident, nor by providence, but by human hands in the dead of night. The hollow awoke to screams echoing across the ridge, a sound so raw it stripped the leaves from the trees. Men rushed into the dark with muskets in hand, women clutching shawls tight against their throats. By dawn, the truth was laid bare in the frost. Josiah Grimby's eldest son was found face down in the mud outside his father's barn. His skull had been split clean in two by the blade of an axe. The weapon itself lay discarded inches away, its handle soaked through, its head sunk deep into the earth as if the ground itself had tried to swallow the evidence. Grimby stood over the body, his rage so volcanic it made men step back. He swore vengeance on whoever had dared touch his blood, his roar carrying through the hollow like a beast in pain. He named names at random, neighbors, rivals, even kin who had looked at him with doubt in the meeting house. His grief was wildfire, and it needed no proof to burn. But Prudence noticed the details others ignored. The prints in the mud were too small for a man of Grimby's size. A broken lantern glass glittered near the barn door, suggesting the boy had been lured outside. And in the half-light she thought she saw another set of prints, bare feet, light and swift, vanishing toward the tree line, a message left for eyes sharp enough to see. The hollow erupted in retaliation. Grimby's men accused the Stokes family, and within hours their smokehouse was in flames. Meritable stood in the road, wailing curses while neighbors dragged her possessions into the dirt. The Reverend preached calm, but no one listened. The law of Cedar Hollow was no longer the bell tower. It was the law of blood answered with blood. Prudence stood in her doorway as the fire lit the night, Isaac clutching her skirt, his small body trembling. She did not comfort him. Instead, she whispered into his hair words he would never forget. This is only the beginning. And in her chest, a certainty hardened. The hollow had taken her sons one by one. Now it would take itself apart. All she had to do was guide the knife. Cedar Hollow no longer breathed as one body. It blood in fragments. Within a week of Grimby's boy being cut down, 3 more were dead. None by wolves, none by accident, none by the invisible hand of plague. These were killings by design. Executions in barns, ambushes in fields, poison slipped into morning coffee. The Stokes family struck first. They swore Grimby had framed them, that he had planted whispers to justify his own power. One night, his tobacco shed went up in flames, and inside, 2 of his hired men burned alive. Their screams were heard clear across the valley, until only the crackle of collapsing timber remained. Grimby answered by dragging Meritable's youngest kin from her cabin and hanging him from the old oak that marked the meeting path. The body swayed for 2 days before anyone dared cut it down. The Reverend thundered that God himself would strike the guilty, but even he knew his pulpit had gone hollow. Every act of violence was answered with another. Trust, the one currency that had bound frontier life, had collapsed into ash. Men no longer borrowed tools or traded seed. Women drew their wells at night, eyes darting at every snapping twig. Even children, once chasing each other through the fields, now hid behind doors, whispering prayers they barely understood. And through it all, Prudence Hoffman moved like a shadow. She spoke little, but when she did, her words slid like hooks into raw flesh. She reminded one farmer that Grimby had once cheated his father out of a debt. She told another that Meritable's herbs had caused miscarriages in 2 cabins. She did not accuse, she only recalled, suggested, reminded. The hollow filled in the rest. Neighbors began to seek her out, not as a victim, but as an oracle. They asked what she had seen, what she remembered, what her instincts told her. And she answered in fragments, each one sharpening their thirst for retribution. She had become the silent compass of their rage, though none of them dared name it. Standing at her window one night, Prudence watched the glow of another burning cabin stain the sky red. Isaac clung to her skirt, wide-eyed, but she didn't look down at him. Her whisper was for the flames alone. Now you see, the hollow is only as righteous as the secrets it hides. The night she chose her path was colder than the others, the first frost laying silver across the garden rows. Isaac slept upstairs, his breath soft and fragile in the loft, while Prudence sat alone at the kitchen table, the single candle burning low. Before her lay Samuel's knife, freshly honed, the edge catching firelight like a sliver of the moon. She had polished it until her fingers bled. For months, she had let the hollow consume itself, feeding suspicion with careful silences, with memories sharpened into daggers for others to wield. But now, the fury inside her demanded more. It was not enough to watch her neighbors bleed. She wanted the blade in her hand. She wanted the breath of her enemies to end beneath her grip. She remembered Thomas's broken body at the base of Miller's Bluff, Benjamin's pale lips in the stillness of fever, Isaac's cries in the night echoing with a terror no child should know. These were not accidents. These were sacrifices made to power. Power that the Grimby farm, the Stokes matron, and even the Reverend guarded like treasure. If her sons were gone, then so too would fall those who had hidden behind piety, respectability, and lies. Prudence rose from the table and moved to the chest in the corner. Inside was Samuel's musket, a powder horn, and 3 shot bags. She lifted the weapon with a steady hand. It felt heavier than she remembered, but the weight steadied her pulse. She loaded it carefully, each motion ritualistic powder, patch, ball, ramrod, prime. The hollow thought her a widow wrapped in grief. Soon they would see her as something else entirely, but she would not strike blindly. That was the hollow's way, chaos, impulse, rage. Prudence's vengeance would be precise. She would choose targets that mattered, cut through the heart of Cedar Hollow's corruption, one name at a time. Outside, the wind howled against the cabin walls like the voices of the dead. She stood in the doorway, knife at her hip, musket resting against the frame, and she whispered to the darkness, "You took my sons. Now I take yours." In that moment, Prudence Hoffman ceased to be a victim. She became the executioner the Hollow had unknowingly created. The first life she claimed was chosen with the precision of a surgeon. Not Grimby himself. That would have been too bold too soon. Not Meritable Stokes. Her death would send ripples too wide. No, Prudence knew the Hollow needed a warning, a taste of what was coming, a strike that would be remembered not just for who fell, but for how. It was Elias Corwin, the Reverend's nephew, a young man with loose lips and watchful eyes. He had been the one spreading whispers that Prudence had bewitched the Hollow with grief, that her silence was a curse driving men to madness. His words were poisoning the ground she had so carefully seeded. And so she chose him as the first cut. The night was moonless, the air sharp with the bite of frost. Prudence moved like a shadow through the oaks, Samuel's knife tucked against her wrist, the musket strapped across her back. She knew Elias's habits. He often lingered after evening prayers, cutting across the ridge path alone to return to his uncle's cabin. That arrogance, that faith that no harm would come to the shepherd's kin, was his undoing. She waited where the trail narrowed, where limestone walls pressed close like the jaws of a trap. When Elias's footsteps crunched on frozen leaves, her pulse slowed, her breath deepened. She did not hesitate. One hand shot out, dragging him into the dark. The other pressed the blade beneath his ribs, upward and sure, silencing his gasp before it became a scream. His blood steamed against the cold as he crumpled at her feet. Prudence knelt, watching his eyes search hers, wide with the horror of recognition. She leaned close and whispered so only he would ever hear, "This is for Thomas." When his body stilled, she worked quickly. She left the musket ball on his chest, a calling card that would speak louder than words. A promise that this death was not chaos, but judgment. Then she melted back into the woods, leaving only silence behind. By morning, the Hollow would find him sprawled on the ridge, his mouth frozen open, as if still trying to shout the truth. Panic would spread like wildfire, and all eyes would turn toward one another with fresh terror. And Prudence, returning to her cabin before dawn, washed the blade in her basin, calm as a woman finishing her chores. Her hands no longer trembled. They had found their true work. They found Elias at dawn, stiff with frost, sprawled like an offering on the ridge path. The musket ball glinted on his chest, blackened from powder but untouched by flesh. A symbol, not a weapon. The Reverend collapsed to his knees, his cries breaking the morning quiet, while others stood in a circle, too afraid to touch the body, as if death itself might spread through their fingertips. Whispers churned before the sun had even cleared the trees. Some swore the ball meant Grimby had struck, a warning to the Reverend for speaking against him. Others claimed it was the Stokes clan, desperate to break the old alliance between church and field. A few, bolder still, muttered that it was no man at all, but a spirit roaming the Hollow, punishing sin with silent steel. By midday, 2 cabins had barred their doors, 3 men walked armed even to the well, and Meritable was shrieking in the road that the Reverend had brought the devil into Cedar Hollow through his own kin. Grimby stormed into the meeting house with his musket loaded and demanded names. The Reverend's sermon dissolved into curses and accusations, spittle flying, voice raw. The air inside the Hollow grew so heavy that even children pressed their palms over their ears. And through it all, Prudence said nothing. She stood at the back of the crowd, face pale beneath her bonnet, Isaac's small hand curled inside hers. To anyone watching, she was just another widow trembling at the violence that stalked them. But inside, she felt the coil of satisfaction tighten. They had not looked at her, not once. By evening, the story of Elias's death had already grown larger than the body itself. Some said his eyes had been gouged out. Others claimed his tongue had been nailed to a tree. None of it was true, yet each retelling carried the weight of prophecy. Fear had become the Hollow's scripture, and Prudence its unspoken author. That night, as the bells tolled for Elias, Prudence lit no candle. She sat in the dark, listening to the Hollow's morning rise and fall like the tide. Isaac slept beside her, curled against her skirts. She whispered into the shadows, not to her son, not to God, but to the hollow itself. You are mine now. In the weeks after Elias Corwin's death, the hollow spoke more of ghosts than of neighbors. No one dared say murder aloud. It was as though naming it would invite the same fate. Instead, the tale grew spectral, carried from cabin to cabin on hushed tongues. Some swore they had seen Elias walking the ridge on moonlit nights, eyes black as coal, mouth gaping like the wound that killed him. Others claimed they heard his voice in the trees, warning that judgment had only just begun. Children were forbidden from venturing beyond their thresholds after dusk, yet more than one admitted to hearing a woman's whisper outside their window, low and steady, like a prayer turned curse. It was then that the name began, the widow of Cedar Hollow. Not Prudence, not Hoffman, not flesh and bone. A figure half remembered, half invented, who walked with the dead and carried grief like a blade. The widow was everywhere and nowhere, both a warning and a weapon. The Reverend thundered that it was Satan himself in petticoats, loosed upon their land. Grimby spat that it was the Stokes clan spreading lies to cover their guilt. Meritable shrieked that the Reverend's prayers had birthed a witch. Each accusation deepened the hollow's hunger, and still no one guessed the truth. That the widow walked among them each Sunday, face hidden by mourning black, hand clasped around her boys. Prudence listened to their fears as one might listen to a hymn. Every rumor was a brick in the altar she was building, one no man could topple. Yet she knew whispers alone would not sustain her legend. Fear demanded proof, and she would give it blood again. So she began to plan. The next name she chose was not a talker but a keeper. Jonas Pike, the miller, a man who traded favors for silence. He had known which debts buried which men, which feuds carved the hollow into rival camps. His tongue was not reckless like Elias's, but it was heavy with secrets, and Prudence feared he might stumble upon her shadow if left alive. Jonas Pike's mill had always smelled of damp wheat and iron filings, the stones grinding day and night to feed Cedar Hollow. It was there among the creaking gears and rushing water that Prudence chose to set her mark. A death in the mill would not just silence Jonas. It would echo in every loaf of bread, every sack of flour, every mouth that fed from his hand. She studied his habits in silence. Jonas worked late, often alone, his lantern glowing through the cracks of the millhouse, long after the rest of the hollow had gone dark. He prided himself on his strength, on his ability to wrestle the stubborn machinery into obedience. Pride, Prudence thought, was always the first crack in a man's armor. The night she came, she wore no bonnet, her hair loose like a veil. The mill wheel turned heavy with autumn rains, the river swollen and wild. Inside, Jonas bent to oil the gears, his muscled back glistening with sweat. He never saw her slip through the shadows. She did not stab him, nor shoot, nor strangle. She simply pulled free the wooden brace that held the great wheel steady. It was a small act, a tug of a wrist, but the wheel shuddered loose like an unchained beast. The machinery roared, gears grinding, teeth snapping. Jonas straightened, eyes wide with dawning horror. Then the shaft caught his sleeve and dragged him forward. The scream was brief. Bone shattered, flesh tore, and in a blink, Jonas Pike was gone, swallowed into the belly of his own mill. Blood sprayed across the stone, seeping into the grain like dye, staining everything it touched. When dawn came, the hollow found him mangled beneath the gears, his body twisted into shapes no man should bear. The Reverend called it punishment for greed. Grimby cursed it as sabotage, and Meritable wailed that the devil himself had turned the wheel. None dared suggest a human hand had guided the fall. But Prudence knew. Standing at the river's edge, washing Jonas's blood from her palms, she whispered into the rush of water, "The widow chooses." And the hollow obeys. It began with whispers, then with accusations. A cow miscarried on the Grimby farm, and Meritable declared it the widow's curse. A child vanished into the woods for half a day, and when he returned muddied but unharmed, neighbors swore he'd been lured by her hand. Even the river's flood, tearing fences from the banks, was laid at her feet. The hollow was no longer hunting a woman. It was hunting a phantom stitched together by its own terror. In the meeting house, the Reverend thundered that the hollow must cleanse itself, root out the witch among them. His words cracked like whips, and his flock trembled, eager for any name that might spare their own. Grimby demanded blood, pointing at the Stokes clan, while Meritable shrieked that Grimby's fields were cursed long before hers. Soon, neighbors dragged one another from cabins, fists and gunstocks doing the work of evidence. A boy of 16 was found hanging from the schoolhouse rafters, accused of consorting with the widow in secret. An old woman was drowned in the creek because her herbs had smelled too sweet. The Hollow's justice no longer required proof, only fear sharpened into frenzy. And through it all, Prudence moved unseen. She kept her head bowed, her mourning dress unremarkable, Isaac at her side like a shield of innocence. No one suspected her, for she was already part of their legend, living and dead in the same breath. The true widow did not need to lift a knife to kill now. The Hollow was butchering itself in her name. At night, she stood at her window, watching torchlight flare across the valley as yet another cabin was set alight. Isaac whispered in his sleep, calling for brothers who would never come. Prudence stroked his hair and whispered back, soft and steady, "The Hollow devours itself. I am only the hand that feeds it." When the last snows melted from the ridges, Cedar Hollow stood silent. Cabins blackened, fences rotted, fields untended. The Reverend's bell tower had toppled in a storm no one lived to rebuild. Meritable was gone, her shrieks swallowed by the woods. Grimby's farm lay abandoned, his musket rusting on the hearth, and yet the Hollow was not empty. Travelers passing through swore they saw a woman in black watching from the tree line, a child at her side, his face pale as moonlight. They said she did not move when hailed, only lifted a hand as though to bless or curse. Some claimed her feet left no tracks in the thawing mud. Others whispered her voice could be heard in the rushing creek, a lullaby or a warning. The widow of Cedar Hollow was no longer a woman. She was a story, one the valley carried in its bones. And in the end, perhaps that was her truest vengeance. Not the blood, not the fire, but the certainty that no one who spoke her name could ever live without fear again. This tale of the widow of Cedar Hollow is not just a story of one woman's grief sharpened into a blade. It is a reminder of how fear, once unchained, can rot a community from within. Whispers become truths, truths become curses, and curses become the law by which neighbors condemn each other. Whether you believe in Prudence as a grieving mother, a cunning executioner, or a specter still haunting the valley, one truth remains: the Hollow never truly buried her.